Hi there. Quick question. Are you planning on going on any lakes this summer? Are you somewhere in South Carolina or Georgia and you just think, man, I've got to get out on a pontoon? Before you go out on those lakes this summer, there is something that I want you to keep in mind. Actually, there's a couple of things. One, there are no natural lakes in South Carolina or Georgia. Every single one is man-made, and I don't think that enough people know that. So, hey, now you have a little something that you can tell your friends. The other thing is that there is something underneath almost every single one of these man-made lakes. And oftentimes that thing is a town, or at least the remnants of a town. As you prepare yourself with your floaties and sunscreen and whatever else, I think it's important that we also pay homage, is it homage or homage? To these places that we go to recreate. It is important to not just go to places and treat them like some nasty, flabby tourist. You should also go in with a sense of wonder and perhaps even a little bit of education about these places. So with that being said, today's video is a compilation of underwater Appalachia videos that I have made on TikTok previously, but I'm putting into a longer compilation here. If you want to see a longer form video on any of these places, please do let me know in the comments down below. But with that being said, let's go and discover just a few of the many underwater towns that do exist in South Carolina and Georgia. Discuss another underwater ghost town, shall we? Today's episode of Underwater Appalachia is actually a little bit outside of Appalachia in the murky, mysterious swamps of South Carolina. I'd like to tell you about the town of Ferguson underneath Lake Marion. Ferguson was an interesting place. It was a company town created by the co-founders of the Santee River Cypress Company. They were Benjamin Franklin Ferguson, hence the name, and Francis Bedler, whose name you might recognize if you live in South Carolina, but we will come back to that. Ferguson was created as a lumber mill settlement in the 1880s, and although Ferguson was the headquarters for the Santee River Cypress Company, the two men that co-founded it were from Chicago. See, much of the lumber in the upper Midwest had already been harvested, and especially in the 1880s, land in the South was cheap, so they took advantage of it. And they bought close to 200,000 acres along the Santee River. They wanted to attract workers from around the world to work in Ferguson, but to attract people to rural South Carolina, especially in the 1880s, they needed to make Ferguson look very appealing. So they put a lot of money into building Ferguson, and they laid out a lot of infrastructure there. They had paved roads, a hotel, a state-of-the-art school, indoor plumbing, and there were street lights that were lit from coal gas. Like, there are still some parts of the South, especially in the mountains where I am, where roads are still gravel. So for roads to be paved back, it was a big deal that this was all there. And by 1890, the post office of Ferguson had opened up. But like many company towns, they were pretty exploitative to the families that lived there. There were roughly 350 families, and in exchange for their work, they were given company money that could be spent at the company stores, but it was not legal US tender. So whatever they earned, they couldn't go out into the real world and purchase with it, so they were essentially a captive audience. I found a very cool article about Ferguson through the University of South Carolina, and in this article, Professor Jessica Elfenbein talks about how Ferguson tied rural South Carolina to Chicago and the rest of the world through this commodity of lumber. It was really interesting to read about. However, in 1915, the Santee River Cypress Company shut down. The workers were laid off, and by the 1920s, the town was essentially abandoned, and that's when Lake Marion was built. Santee River was dammed to supply hydroelectric power to rural areas under FDR's New Deal. Although in the process, between 2,500 and 3,000 people were displaced, and they were mostly African American farmers. 3,000 people is not insignificant. If you live in a more populated area, that might not sound like a lot to you, but I live in a town that doesn't have a lot more than 3,000 people in it, so that's a big chunk of humanity leaving an area. And now sitting on what was formerly Ferguson, rolling farmland, marshes, and river valley landscape is the behemoth that is Lake Marion. It has 315 miles of shoreline, and it covers nearly 110 1,000 acres. It's a huge lake. The parts of the property that were not flooded remained in the Bedler family. Remember Francis Bedler from earlier. And now much of that land is now what is the core of Congaree National Park. Plus the Francis Bedler Forest, a wildlife sanctuary of the National Audubon Society, and the Nature Conservancy. And for the Congaree haters out there who say it's America's worst national park because it's not as stunning as Glacier, listen, John, you're not stunning either. I was really surprised about the sheer amount of information I could find on Ferguson, and I found this one completely fascinating. So let me know what you think about it, and follow along if you like Appalachia, hiking, and nature stuff. Sometimes I do delve outside of Appalachia, obviously, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye. Welcome back to Underwater Appalachia, where we discuss underwater Appalachian ghost towns, and sometimes we go outside Appalachia because it's my show and I can do what I want here. Today we're going down to the Midlands of South Carolina to discuss what lies beneath Lake Murray. And there's a lot. There's more than one town underneath Lake Murray. Lake Murray was dammed by an earthen embankment on the Saluda River. It's a hydroelectric dam that was built by the Lexington Power Company. Construction began in 1927 and it was completed in 1930. And Lake Murray is pretty big. It covers 50,000 acres and there's 650 miles of shoreline. So knowing that, you can imagine that there is a lot beneath Lake Murray. Two major settlements underneath are Dutch Fork and Saxe, Gotha, which I think is an insanely cool name. This was an area settled by German speakers between the Broad and the Saluda rivers in what was known as the Saluda River Valley. Dutch Fork comes from the phrase Deutsch Volk. Listen, I don't speak German, so bear with me. That means German people, so that makes sense. But that's not all, because nearly a dozen small communities had to be abandoned to build the lake. And a few of these other communities included Derrick, Pine Ridge, Lurks Ferry, Selwood, Wessinger, Cantsfield, Leaphart, Sevilla, Boylesville, Lorena, and Holly's Ferry. To acquire the land, the power company purchased 100,000 acres of land from 5,000 plus farms, and they paid people between $15 and $45 per acre. In today's money, that translates to roughly between $276 and $830. And with there being so much underneath Lake Murray, of course there are going to be people that want to go see this, so I came across a really interesting interview with John Baker, who owns a local dive shop, and Steve Franklin, and they dive underneath Lake Murray, and some of the stuff that they have seen is truly like haunting, cool, crazy. Churches, there's schools, there's cemeteries underneath. There's even 3 different types of cemeteries underneath, including single family plots, multi-family plots, and also grave cemeteries. It's estimated that there's 2,300 graves underneath Lake Murray, most of them from the 1800s. Side note, if you want a complete directory of all of the names of the people underneath, you can find that at the Saluda County Museum. But many families chose not to have the graves moved. If you've seen some of my other Underwater Appalachia videos, you know it was pretty common for families to move the graves of their loved ones, but many people didn't want the power company to dig up grandma and put her somewhere else, so they chose to just let their family members lie in peace underneath this giant lake. They've also mentioned that some roads are still visible. They've seen boxcars down there and some stone houses and home sites. One pretty cool story is that they said they were diving down and they found this old stone house, and you can imagine it's pretty dark and murky under there, so it's hard to see, but they swam in through the front door and bumped their head on the back wall. The Weiss's Ferry Bridge is also underneath Lake Murray. It was built in 1911, and if you remember, construction of the lake was completed in 1930, so it was not around for very long before it went overwater to being completely underneath water. There's a stamp on the bridge with the year 1911, and something else that they've said is that a bunch of names of the construction workers who built the bridge are etched into it, which is pretty neat, I think. I had a great time learning about all this. It's fascinating to me. But that'll be it for this time. Follow along if you like hiking Appalachia and nature stuff. And I go outside of Appalachia and talk about things that I just want to sometimes because I can. Okay, bye. Welcome back to Underwater Appalachia, where we discuss underwater Appalachian ghost towns. Today I'm going to tell you about Burton, which sits at the bottom of Lake Burton in Rabun County in North Georgia. Burton was originally called Powellsville, and it was founded by Scotch-Irish settlers, that is difficult to say, in the early 1800s. The town straddled the Tallulah River, and it was considered to be a pretty prosperous place. According to the Rabun County Historical Society, they say it's prosperous because there were large homes along the river. It also had a Methodist church and a Baptist church, and a sawmill, gristmill, and a syrup mill. The town had roughly 200 residents, and it was about 15 miles from present-day Clayton. To put that distance into perspective for those who aren't familiar with the area, that would be about a 30-minute drive in a modern-day vehicle. But back then, it was a full-day trip if you were going by a horse-drawn wagon. So I'm taking a moment to appreciate my modern-day vehicle that can take me wherever I want to go within reason. It was the first gold mining town in North Georgia, and along with the mills as businesses, there was also some moonshining. That was so dumb, but that does sound cool. But the town of Burton was ultimately a sacrifice to the heavy hand of progress when the Georgia Railway and Power Company, a predecessor to Georgia Power, came into town in need of hydroelectric power. Georgia Railway and Power was in need for more electricity to power a new streetcar system in Atlanta. But what does that have to do with a little town in the North Georgia mountains so far from Atlanta? Well, the company created a hydroelectric plant at Tallulah Gorge in 1914. This was followed by 5 additional facilities that were constructed upstream along a 28-mile stretch of the Tallulah and Tugalot rivers. And then they had their eye on Burton to create the Lake Burton Reservoir, not as a hydroelectric generating station, but as a storage and flow regulation facility. And they began those plans in 1917. To get all that property, 65 property owners sold the company thousands of acres of land. However, there was one holdout, and his name was Dr. Murray. He gave Georgia Power the rights to back water up to his property line, but not to submerge it. And today, in his honor, there is a cove called Murray's Cove on the southern end of Lake Burton. The dam was built in December of 1919, and by August of 1920, the lake was completely filled. In my research, I found an article posted by Atlanta Homes Magazine last October, in October of 2024, and I found it annoying because obviously it's selling the area as a place to buy a home or even a second home. It has a little bit of history on the town of Burton, but it calls it Powellsville, which was its name as we discussed, but it doesn't call it the town of Burton, which is interesting. And as part of its history section, there's a little sentence that says, "There's plenty of tall tales about sounds of church bells ringing underneath the water, floating church steeples, and the like." I also learned that apparently Nick Saban has a house on Lake Burton, so there you go, there's your fun fact for the day. I hope that you enjoyed this Underwater Appalachia installment. If you enjoy Appalachia, history, hiking, and nature stuff, that's kind of what I do, so follow along if that's your thing. Okay, bye. Thank you so very much for joining me on today's Underwater Appalachia / slightly outside of Appalachia video today. Like I said at the beginning, please do let me know if you'd like to see a longer video on any of these places. I love obviously researching these towns, and I feel like they need a voice and for people to remember them, because if we don't remember our history, then we're just dumber as people. That's a fact. Please do subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!